This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my very special guest today, what may well be the first of a series of interviews with a student of radiation who has discovered important aspects of how radioactive fallout can affect common diseases. And she's going to explain that, but also how during the course of her research she was led to a key figure by the name of Admiral Strauss, who may have even been involved in the assassination of JFK. Her name is Jennifer Lake. Jennifer, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here.
Tell us where to begin, because your story seems to me quite fascinating.
Well, it's really an immense story. I actually made an outline today for our talk because it's so big, very easy for me to get off track. I went through, it's been about 8 years, I should say, now, researching the story. But the first 3 or 4 years was dedicated to the medical aspects of this. I was gathering information and created a blog for that information. It's called polioforever.wordpress.com. And we'll be drawing heavily on that blog today so that I can explain how I got into this and made these discoveries about, things that we've taken for granted. We believe that vaccines are important tools in medicine. This is what we've been conditioned to believe. And the miracle vaccine, really, of all time, has to be the polio vaccine. It's going all around the world. Today, everyone on the planet is supposed to get this vaccine. It causes a lot of controversy everywhere. But to me, the real hidden history of this vaccine is that it was created in concert with the nuclear testing program because it was meant to act as a fallout vaccine. So
Really, you think that the vaccine was supposed to give some kind of benefits in relation to radiation?
yes, absolutely. I think it's very well documented that that's the case because polio, or poliomyelitis as they call it, is very provably a radiation disease. So this is hidden history to me, and I'm concerned in many ways that this is not going to stay around a long time, that as records and things get transferred into databases on the internet, that a lot of this material is going to be made to disappear. So I've already had a lot of experiences of having some of my resources disappear prior to getting hard copies of things. So I don't want to take that for granted anymore.
Good. No, I think that's a wise observation. I have no doubt you're correct that many documents and records that could be embarrassing to the government are going to disappear during these conversions to digital storage.
So, in a kind of a grandiose title, I've called my outline The Rise of the Military-Industrial Medical Complex. And I've sort of focused in on the beginning of this as happening in the 1890s when they first filtered virus. This was really the first time it became a laboratory entity that they could experiment with. They also invented medical x-rays in this time, in the 1890s. 1895, a man named Willem Röntgen created a medical x-ray. And then they also brought radium to market by the end of the 1890s. And this changed everything. This brought a new platform for biological experimentation into the field of medicine. And of course, medicine is how this was spread about. Radium became a drug. X-rays were actually something that almost anyone could use. Electricians could build X-ray machines. And so there were, people practicing everywhere, just irradiating people because they could. A lot of the damages from these, well, they accumulated quickly. And so really this cover-up started not long after these methods were coming into use. So we've had 120 years or so of this new kind of practice. Because of it, it caused this new field of genetics to open, so that what was once eugenics could actually be pushed underground into a practice of microbiology. So all of this has been very fascinating to me, and I'm just very deep into this story at this point. So I wanted to just briefly go over some of this history and just sort of bring you along until I could introduce this person that you mentioned, this man named Admiral Strauss.
Well, I think this is all terrific, Jenny. I'm very glad that you're doing this. Please continue.
All right. Well, around the turn of the 1900 or so, we see this change because of what I just mentioned, the viruses, the X-rays, and the radium. We see these experimental laboratories become established everywhere. The Rockefeller Foundation in particular, actually they were not the foundation yet, but one of their first laboratories was called the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. They founded themselves on Manhattan Island in New York. We see a change of the Marine Hospital Service, which had been the National Veterans Service, becomes the U.S. Public Health Service at the same time. The Carnegie Foundation was founding its science institutions. A man named Milton Rosenau led the National Hygienic Laboratory. He virtually built this institution himself. And there was a philanthropist in New York named Nathan Strauss. I believe that Nathan Strauss and Admiral Strauss are related, though I have no documentation for that. But he also built laboratories. He was on a mission himself to pasteurize milk. And he built laboratories to prove his version of science. He created milk stations where he could sell actual milk, pasteurized milk, to the public. They would even sell it by the glass. But what was interesting to him was that he was a very committed Zionist. He went abroad all over the world and set up one of his premier laboratories in Jerusalem, which he then donated to Chaim Weizmann. This became one of the anchor labs for the Weizmann Institute. So all these laboratories were forming in this time. Of course, there was a big chemical industry that was coming up in the world. What became IG Farben, it was called the Big Six back in those days, and they were providing a lot of the chemicals that were being shipped in trade to the United States. But as hostilities rose toward World War I, there was a cutoff of a lot of that industry and trade. So the United States had to create its own chemical industry. And so we also see experimental agricultural labs being created at that time. A lot of the new chemicals coming onto market were for agriculture. Pesticides. In 1913, they had the Haber-Bosch breakthrough for creating ammonium nitrate. And this was considered one of the biggest breakthroughs in the history of mankind. Suddenly, they had fertilizer. And it was not long before there was a great deal of new types of illness going around. It culminated really in what was called the Great Influenza, the Spanish flu, which came at the end of the involvement in World War I. So this is about the place in the story where a young man named his name was Louis Lichtenstein Strauss, comes into the picture. He was born in 1896. According to his own memoir, he left a book behind called Men and Decisions. And there's only been one additional biography written about him, which is kind of extraordinary when you think about it because of this man's history. He became a banker in a firm called Kuhn Loeb Company. He then went on to be an officer in the Office of Naval Intelligence. He became an admiral during World War II. He basically ran the Bureau of Ordnance, creating weapons. This was how he started learning to do big projects. He went from there to being the first commissioner ever appointed to the Atomic Energy Commission. And then under Eisenhower, he became the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. And it was his job to promote the building of nuclear power plants, to promote the development of weapons. And he would take his last public service job as a Secretary of Commerce. He was never approved for that job by the Senate. So he served 1 year and then he drops off the radar, more or less. But he was really at the peak of his power at that time. And this is when he wrote that memoir. It's not an autobiography, he says himself. It's not an autobiography. It's a very controlled demonstration of what he wanted people to know about him. So as I started digging into polio, I found out that this man, at the age of 21, became the president of a polio hospital. And that was startling to me. He had no qualifications for this job. But when he started out, he was attached to Herbert Hoover. And during World War I, before the United States got involved, Hoover was heading something called the Committee for Relief of Belgium. They were organizing food shipments over there to feed the starving Belgians, as far as Americans knew. Eustace Mullins has always claimed that the food relief programs were really there to feed the war, to get food to Germans so that they could stay in the war. The first 2 years or so of World War II were kind of World War I rather, where it was a non-starter. They weren't able to continue without supplies. And so there's a very deep history about the wartime work that was done. And he stayed very close to Herbert Hoover for all of his life. They would do other relief organizations. These become important in terms of looking at the sort of undercover diplomacy that went on through these organizations. And when we get into the pre-Manhattan Project years, Louis Strauss's personal sponsorship of scientists becomes a very, very important part of what will happen in the world as it organized along nuclear hegemony.
Well, this really is quite something. I mean, you're getting into the whole background of why things are, in a way, such a mess today with regard to nuclear energy. I mean, it even gives us a background in relation to Fukushima, but also, you know, even up to the TSA using all of these scanners, which have never been tested for their effects on the human body. So I think what you're doing, Jennifer, is really providing a whole lot of information about a history that has been hidden from the American people that richly deserves to be exposed.
It very much does, you know. You can't hide this forever, you know, it comes back around. You know, when you look back to X-ray treatment, the X-rays itself, Jim, was treatment. I don't know if you know that, but I didn't know that when I first started to look at this. If you had children with earaches, they were taken and given X-ray treatments to the head. I read recently that Roger Ebert, who died from cancer, had received X-ray treatment for acne when he was young. and that he died of jaw cancer, and he believes that that was the nature of that cancer, induced in him as a young man. But it's amazing how much they knew about damage from radiation fairly early on.
But went ahead and used it on a wide scale for a variety of ailments where it would do no positive good whatsoever and tremendous harm anyway.
Yes, more or less. I don't know how they covered up all of this. I really don't. I think this was just so exciting to them. They found it to be an incredible experimental tool. And without it, they could never have done the kinds of genetic explorations that they did. It's one of the famous researchers on that was a man named Hermann Mueller, who started irradiating fruit flies sort of in a simulation of evolution. This is what they always claimed, that if they could irradiate these experimental creatures, they would sort of time lapse on evolution and just watch a rapid mutation take shape. But I don't think one has anything to do with the other. It's such an invasive type of activity that, these aberrations occur. There's, changes to the genes. Mueller wrote some very interesting papers during the 20s. They were experimenting on embryos and seeing how they could alter development by irradiating embryos. He made predictions that a lot of the illnesses that we have today were going to come into the world at huge rates in the population, and he was right.
Because of exposure to radiation?
Yes, and we see those kind of rates coming today. 1 in 4 having cancer in their lifetime, or 2 in 4. We're working towards these higher numbers. So,
and if cell phones bring about excessive exposure to electromagnetic waves to the brain, then we're going to have a veritable epidemic that's going to emerge in vast numbers here in the very near future.
Well, I think that epidemic is already underway. There's a lot of claims about radio frequency radiation being of a different sort, but in fact, on a biological level, the damage is very similar. So many of the things they learned from X-rays and from fallout and from workers in the nuclear industry are injuries that are familiar, and they are happening under the influence of radio frequency. So we do have an epidemic underway. I think it's fascinating, too, that some of the stuff that I'm still working on is, these polio-like diseases. Did I mention that polio didn't go away?
Yeah, we thought it had been rendered extinct, that there was no more polio in the world, but all of a sudden we've had a resurgence. What's going on there, Jennifer?
Well, there's more radiation in the world than there ever has been, Jim. I think all these chickens are coming home to roost.
So, of course, your views about the origin of polio having been related to radiation are very different than the idea of polio as a function of a virus or some bacterium. Correct.
And the whole virus issue with polio is very controversial, and that's almost giving it too much credit. There is a researcher named Jim West who insists that the polio virus has never actually been isolated, and that he's shared some documentation to show that the people who get credit for the isolation actually didn't do it. But this has been one of the murkiest topics that I've ever looked at.
Well, if the virus has never been isolated, it's very difficult to imagine how you could develop some antivirus to deal with it.
Well, yeah, bingo. So, what was it really all about? That was something that I wanted to look at and explore. And An interesting fact that came up in looking at polio was that part of its description is that most people who get it, they say 95% of the people who get it just get a flu, and it's gone. They recover. None the wiser. They never knew. So there is a very close relationship to influenza. And as I looked historically at these epidemics, one would happen within the other. There would always be polio involved in what they were calling influenza, which made the whole Spanish flu of the end of World War I a really fascinating subject, a very confusing subject. But there were many things involved there. I think, there's agreement among people who do research on this that there were multiple kinds of illnesses going around. There was a lot of scientific experimentation going on. And institutions like the Rockefeller were making inroads in creating a public health establishment. During the war, they became the military's laboratory. And amongst, hospitals and established medical facilities, they were a very fringe institution. They had a reputation for doing very weird science there. Nobody really believed the things that they said, stuff that they came out with. There was a director named Simon Flexner who announced back in 1911 that they were going to make a polio vaccine. Of course, we know the vaccine didn't come along until 1955. But they were always on the cusp of these breakthroughs. But one of the most interesting things was in their mission statement. When they were founded, they said that they were going to study polio and promote the pasteurization of milk. So now I mentioned a man named Nathan Strauss. He was the milk king, they called him. He was the man that was going to pasteurize everybody's milk. And there's a relationship here because the polio virus, as they call it, is an enterovirus. It lives in the intestine, they say, of just human beings. But when you alter the natural goodness, let me just say that, the natural goodness of milk, when you change it through pasteurization, when you kill off the living entities in the milk, you basically destroy its ability then to benefit the human intestine, to create a condition of gut flora that keeps a person healthy in their life. It's a recipe for chronic disease.
Yeah, you'd think, if there was something dangerous about natural milk that would be affecting cows, after all, there would be some massive outbreak of udder cancer or who knows what, intestinal problems, ulcers, whatever else could be attributed to it. So that you're suggesting the whole process of pasteurization is not only unnecessary, but is actually deleterious by reducing the health benefits of milk.
Yes, absolutely. So, but they really put the pressure on to get milk pasteurized and to get people to accept it. They also, through propaganda, tied the incidence of polio to milk in many ways. And what's interesting about this, too, is that they were putting things into the feed of the cows. Cows themselves, in many cases, were not healthy animals at that time. They were getting a lot of pesticides in their feed. They were also getting formaldehyde in their feed because it increases milk production. And one of the things that they learned is that now there was excessive formaldehyde content in the milk, and that formaldehyde causes biological damage very similar to X-rays.
And, of course, formaldehyde is not beneficial to human beings or other living things. Jenny, we got to take our first break. It's a real pleasure to have you here. Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my special guest, Jennifer Lake. We'll be right back.
Even Bush admits that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11. Our own FBI acknowledged it has no hard evidence that ties Osama bin Laden to 9/11. But if Saddam had nothing to do with 9/11, and if Osama had nothing to do with 9/11, then who did? Who did it? The 9/11 conspiracy provides the answer. Discover the big picture. Learn what we know now. Find out what it means. 11 experts contribute to exposing the truth as the anatomy of an atrocity. Edited by James H. Fetzer. Buy it now if you have the courage to face the truth. Just don't think you're going to like it. The 9/11 conspiracy provides the answer.
This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, continuing my conversation with Jennifer Lake about the history of really radiation technology in America and its wide array of damaging effects that deserve exposure. And I'm so glad you've done all this work on this subject, Jennifer.
Well, thank you. You know, I was really following my heart in a lot of ways. I found the whole subject extremely fascinating. Always been very interested in science and, you know, what causes all these controversies to begin with. So I was required to do a disease presentation for my nursing class, and that's what started. It was a requirement. I didn't choose it openly, you could say, but once I got at a certain place along this path, it just sort of took its own momentum at that point.
Well, you seem to have a knack for research because you're exposing a whole lot of stuff that certainly I have never heard before, and seems to me of extreme importance, really, to grasp the bigger picture, the background with regard to the host of issues, but the whole, nuclear or radiation technology industry up to and including nuclear power plants.
Yeah. Well, I would like to see a lot of discussion. I would like to see a lot of activity on these issues on the net, on people's blogs, in the media, wherever it can be.
You know, your point about pasteurization just strikes me as one more illustration where, a product is looking for a market and it creates, a false impression, like the need for pasteurization then requires this new pasteurizing technology that actually doesn't benefit those who purchase the milk, but reduces the benefits that the milk unpasteurized would provide. So, I've not before really appreciated the controversy over raw milk and pasteurization, but I think you're making it very clear.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of people are rediscovering it as, a medicinal aid. And, there's a sort of a farm-to-table movement, a slow food movement. A lot of these, are educating people toward those very benefits because we need them now more than ever. Generations of bottle babies behind us now. In fact, in 1971, it was the all-time low for breastfeeding children in the United States. So many people have never had the benefits of, being naturally raised. And then throw vaccines and things like that on top of that. And we are a very challenged population. I think we're extremely challenged from nuclear testing. It's kind of boggles the mind, but the United States did so many of its tests in southern Nevada, and that allowed the fallout to just cover North America. One of the things that I believe about Strauss, after World War II, when he got into the structure of the whole nuclear program, he insisted on fallout detection as his first initiative as an atomic energy commissioner. He was so well connected to science. I mean, he really handpicked people who would work on these programs for him. And fallout detection became his specialty, and it's really a very simple plan. I mean, they just sent planes up there with filters on them to collect air samples. So any country virtually could do this. And I believe that, the whole weather control has come down on us over our heads as a mode of fallout control. I think they really took this up seriously during the 1950s to bring down this fallout, to hide the amount of testing that was going on. That to me seems like a great motive. When you look at Louis Strauss's associates in this period, these were people who became, the credited scientists. They made these discoveries, and they were all very close colleagues of his. But I don't really want to jump ahead too much. It's confusing. It's such a big story, and that was the reason for my outline that I shared with you, Jem, so that we could really just understand things. When I start deconstructing this relationship of Strauss to the JFK assassination, I've sort of taking it back to what was considered one of the issues, one of the probable motives, which was the Israeli nuclear weapons program. I think it's a lot more than that. So I believe that nuclear traffic is really the issue here. And when you sort of get back in time, when radium came on the market and what was happening, it's amazing. It was sold at the price of $150,000 per gram. That's about 1/28 of an ounce. And very, very small amounts of this were made available to people for experimental purposes because of the price. This was back in the early 1920s. And in this same time here, they found a very high-grade source of uranium in the Belgian Congo. It was a mine called Shinkolobwe mine. And there was one company in particular called the Union Minière de Haute-Katanga, Tanganyika, under the control of Belgian colonials. It was still, I guess, subject to Belgium at that time, quite late, in fact, for the Congo. And because of another part of the story, which is early atomic development, I think things were positioned in such a way to create, sort of a quiet trade in radium, in uranium, and get this materials to the people that knew how to use it and apply it for weapons purposes. This is another fascinating part of the story to me. So in 1921, there was a description of something that I read in a biography of Einstein. And it mentioned that he was giving some kind of presentation in Prague, and he was approached by a young physicist who told him that he had a machine that he could prove caused fission. Now, as far as the world knows, nobody could prove fission until 1938, 39. So this is almost 2 decades ahead. So in this recollection, the biographer just sort of brushes past this little incident, that nothing was made of it. But right after this meeting that Einstein had, he went on a tour with Chaim Weizmann. They came to the United States to raise money for Hebrew University and for other Zionist causes at the time. And he went all over the country at that time. He ended up making a very good connection with a group of doctors who formed an organization on his behalf at that time. But when he returned, his first visit when Einstein returned to Europe was to visit the Rothschilds, and then he was given a very special new laboratory in Prague so that he could work there and bring a coterie of people around himself who had similar interests. And I think they started working on it then. That's also the advent of high-energy particle accelerators. Early 1920s is when these things came into the world. And one of the things that you can do with a particle accelerator is you can create fuel for nuclear weapons. And that seems to be relatively easy to do. So we've been spreading this technology in one way or another. The Americans were very far behind the Europeans on this score. But interestingly, so many of them found that they could, meet up with each other through the auspices of these food relief programs. So this is more or less the real support and the real context for the life of Louis Strauss. When he came back, actually he went to the Paris peace negotiations. He stayed with Hoover all throughout this period. They were going to offer him the job of controller of League of Nations, and he turned that down in favor of becoming a Kuhn Loeb banker. So he came back to New York. It was 1919. He gave the date as 9/19/19. That was the day that he was made a Kuhn Loeb banker. And he lived the high life in this time. He was being instructed by some of the most experienced investment bankers in the business, Otto Kahn, Jerome Hanauer. These men were experts at reorganizing companies. They reorganized railroads. Would you excuse me for just 1 second?
Sure, Jenny, sure.
To take a break, but okay. All right. Things were about to get really noisy, so.
No, that's fine.
I thought
I have a cat who frequently makes debuts on the show.
Anyway, where was I? Early 1920s, really. So he was groomed for this. He was simultaneously a president of a polio hospital. The hospital belonged to the Rothschilds. It was founded in 1905. It was a dispensary when it was founded, but there were the two brothers that were in-laws to them. Their names were Frauenthal, and they ran this hospital as an orthopedic institution. Well, it very quickly became a polio hospital. The first real big epidemic of polio occurred in 1907, and there's really almost no record of Strauss other than, his name fixed to a document that he was the president of this hospital. There's nothing in his memoirs. He never speaks of it. No other biographer ever speaks of it. I have come across this man's shadow everywhere. His name is everywhere, but there's almost nothing there. So he's been able to conceal this power as a Rothschild agent. During this whole food relief thing, he acted as the liaison for the Joint Jewish Distribution Committee, which was being run by the Warburgs. Now, the Warburgs were family to Kuhn Loeb. They were family to Jacob Schiff. And Louis Strauss married his boss's daughter there at the bank, and he became family too. But he was one of the first, what they said was a non-family member to join the firm. And at that time, financially, they were on a par with the Morgan Bank and Lehman Brothers too, apparently. but they were globetrotting. They were going all over the world looking for international investment in what they were working on. This had long been the story of the United States, that seeking international investment in its industrial infrastructure. But these guys became quite the masters of the field. And one thing that he did personally was he nurtured industries. He started things growing. In 1922, he met two young men who had developed a camera. It was a color camera, and he arranged for them to go to Eastman Kodak and get a laboratory that I think is the Hawkeye Works lab today. But he showed his method here. They tried to...
Was it located then in Rochester, adjacent to Kodak?
Yes, Kodak was...
Amazing.
Kodak was always in Rochester.
Just for those who are unaware, research on the Zapruder film, the whole movie of the assassination of JFK that's so well known to the public, was taken to Hawkeye Works, this secret CIA lab adjacent to Kodak, immediately after the assassination, and a 16-millimeter unsplit copy of the altered film was taken to the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington, D.C. on Sunday, where it was substituted for the original, which had been brought there the day before from Dallas as an 8-millimeter already split film that had been developed there, so that Hawkeye Works becomes, quite crucial covertly in creating a false impression of the true causes of death of the 35th President of the United States.
Yes. Well, these two fellows that Strauss was sponsoring invented the Kodachrome film, which became the stock movie film for Kodak. And of course, that's what they did there at Hawkeye Works prior to, some of its extracurricular work for the government, was that they were producing movie cameras and film. So this was early. This was 1922. So we see him out decades ahead of some of these connections. But, he was building, and I see him as a builder of a network, what I consider to be a machine. By the time that he came into his power really as atomic energy chief, he had this incredible network in place. So,
Jennifer, before I hope this isn't taking us back too far, but when you were talking about events around 1916, the epidemics of influenza and polio, you mentioned that how the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research became the official lab for the U.S. military, and included the Black Tom Island explosion, where John J. McCloy handled the legal case. John J. McCloy, resurfaces here several times, but it's remarkable to me that he would, of course, become eventually our High Commissioner to Germany, the chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, and would attend a ratification meeting at the home of Clint Murchison the night before the assassination, where Lyndon Johnson would subsequently appoint him and Ellen Dulles to the two civilian seats on the Warren Commission, where they both had these very long histories with the American military and covert operations, and really didn't represent the public in any particular sense, and clearly were deeply involved in the assassination itself.
Yes. Well, John J. McCloy and Louis Strauss were very close. I think McCloy considered Strauss something of a mentor, at least as far as, what Strauss was doing with banking. Of course, McCloy himself, was a lawyer. His firm, Milbank, Tweed, Hadley, something. There were some interchangeable names there, but basically it was the Milbank firm that he worked for. It was one of many, and Cravath was another firm that he worked for. And they were not only Kuhn Loeb's lawyers, but they were the Rockefellers' lawyers. You see a circle of people come together and get very tight right through this period in the 1920s. And he was a big time up and comer. He had a reputation for getting things done. This was always true of John J. McCloy. So eventually he earned the name of chairman of the establishment. That's the name of a biography that was written about him. Kai Bird is one of the authors of that book. I'm not sure if there's a second author of that book or not, but he was quite an amazing fellow in his way. Had a gift for playing both sides of the fence and getting people to see it his way, I guess. He was a disarmament diplomat. He was dispatched on a lot of, quiet missions to take care of business. But at this time, in this sort of pre-World War I time, he was just getting out of law school. So this was a very plum assignment for him. I should explain a little bit Black Tom Island. On July 31st, there was a railhead across New York Harbor on the Jersey side where they stashed all of these munitions and other supplies that were going to be shipped out to the Allies. The U.S. Was not in the war. We did not enter the war until 1917. But in 1916, giving very active aid to our allies. And one night, the night of July 31st, this island just exploded, and it kept on exploding, and it burned to cinders in 2 weeks. Over 2 weeks' time, this plume of smoke. It was like the World Trade Center fires. If you can imagine, that's what it must have looked like at the time. And across the city in Brooklyn, within 2 weeks, there was a massive polio outbreak. This is the largest thing that had happened up to the time. And it caused martial law in New York City. They quarantined the city. No one under 16 was allowed to leave. And this really set the tone of how people were going to respond to outbreaks of this illness. They didn't identify it as polio at the time, not to the public. I don't think hardly anybody knew what polio was. There had only been very small outbreaks before. 1907 was really the first of the big outbreaks in the United States. So 1916 is still very early in this process. And what was different about this was that the victims were mostly children. They were under the age of 5. This would never be true again about polio. By the 1950s, 80% of the victims were adults.
Jenny, this is fascinating. We're going to take our second break. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my very special guest today, Jennifer Lake, who's reviewing the rise of the military-industrial medical complex. There's a whole lot here. We'll be right back.
We can now say, with moral certainty and considerable scientific authority, that the death of JFK was committed by a meticulously executed conspiracy which was obscured by an extensive cover-up. Murder in Dealey Plaza, edited by James Fetzer, goes to the heart of the JFK assassination. You'll read new and up-to-date information regarding the Secret Service, the Lincoln limousine, the medical evidence, the cover-up, altering the film, framing the patsy, and the silent historians. Also, 16 smoking guns, each one crushing the government's lone assassin scenario. A world-class chronology of November 22nd, 1963. Chapters by David W. Mantic, Gary Aguilar, Vincent Palomero, Douglas Weldon, Jack White, Ira David Wood III, James H. Fetzer, Doug Horn, and a classic essay by Bertrand Russell. The complete story in the pages of one single book, edited by James H. Fetzer. Read it now, read it again. You'll use it as a reference. Murder in Dealey Plaza. Available at Amazon.com and major bookstores around the world. It's murder.
This is Jim Fetzer, your host, continuing my conversation with Jennifer Lake about the rise of the military-industrial medical complex. Another aspect of this, of course, Jennifer, turns out to be when Judith Very Baker was lured to New Orleans to participate in the development of a rapid-acting cancer vaccine that could be used to kill political opponents. It was originally designed for Fidel Castro, but appears to have been used on Jack Ruby and no doubt others as well. So I think the idea of tying medicine in with the military-industrial complex is in fact very important, and therefore I believe your survey of the history of its rise is going to be of great interest and important.
Well, I hope people will pursue it and go to polioforever.wordpress.com. There's a lot to read there. It's a product of a lot of hard work, but, not to read it for my sake, but for the fact that, this really is fascinating. I mean, I can't determine what's more important for people to know, but there's so much information there about what we think of as very common diseases. Flu is a big story. I actually started my name blog because of the so-called H1N1, the when pigs fly flu.
Yes.
Yes. And to find out what a fraud that entire thing was. But, the fear-mongering, the statements that are being made, the push to get people to go get vaccinated. This is...
And many of these vaccines seem to have deleterious effects on human beings. They seem to be contributing factors to autism, among other problems.
Among many other problems.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we're on the verge of, you've brought us up to the end of the 1920s and to the beginning of the early atomic development in terms of a whole host of international conferences and research.
Right. So there are all these parallel threads going on. There was very little development in the United States. Like I said, the Europeans were, way far ahead. Of course, they had a lot of support. And a lot of that, like I said, was generated through this Belgian Relief Committee. A lot of these relationships were established there. The physicists got together at something called the Solvay conferences, named for a Belgian. I think his name was Ernest Solvay. But, many of these relationships were established there. There's a lot of private sponsorship going on of scientists in this time. Einstein was beginning to make a name for himself. And like I said, in 1921 or so, he got a new laboratory in Prague. Certainly not, able to find something specific about what was going on there, but they were really well aware of atomic energy. This is something that had been proposed. In fact, the very equation of E equals mc squared, and this was proposed by a man named Samuel Preston, in 1875. He was an Englishman. And in fact, the Englishmen were out in front of a lot of this atomic science. They take credit for describing the parts of an atom. Ernest Rutherford became very famous in the UK for his work on atomic physics. But the real centers were going on there. A Danish man named Niels Bohr, I've identified him as the real father of the bomb because he created a center in Copenhagen where all of these European physicists, actually the Americans too, everyone could come. People came from China and everywhere. They were all welcome in his institute to study physics. So this was all in motion here in the early 20s. And like I say, I think this has been kept secret. We have a banker, an American banker, Henry Goldman of Goldman Sachs, who was personally paying out of pocket to Albert Einstein and Einstein's best friend, a man named Max Born, who was also a great teacher of physicists. Goldman was paying them. He was keeping them going in this incredible financial crunch that went on in Weimar Germany. We've all heard about this. You know, the Deutschmark went from, you know, having an equivalency to a dollar, I don't know how many, 3, 4 to a dollar, to like 4 million to a dollar. That period of a few years there was very hard to survive. But they were sort of picked out at that time to get special support. So I think these projects were nurtured in secret. I see evidence of these scientists working in hospital laboratories and developing a lot of this technology under cover of medical treatment. We see later that Strauss himself, he's a very, very rich man by now, of course. You know, he would be equivalent to a billionaire today. He was able to buy this technology and bring it over at his own expense and bring it into the United States. So he was actually having to import nuclear technology. He is famous for sponsoring scientists himself. But, you know, I wanted to say something that there's an incident in Strauss's life, and this is one of the reasons why he became such a suspect for me being involved with JFK, is that he has this trail of incidents and activities where he abused his power, where he, you know, brought people to ruin and to death. And he's so closely involved, and there's a pattern forming in these relationships that he has. Even the founder of the polio hospital that he was the president of, after he left that hospital, he resigned, joined the ONI. 2 years later, that founder of the hospital plunged off the top of the building. And then his wife was put away in a mental asylum for the rest of her life. Now, because it's all so sketchy, you know, it just that the early incident doesn't mean very much. But you see more of this. Even up until in the 1940s, Strauss was the assistant for James Forrestal, who was Secretary of the Navy at the end of the war. He later became the first Secretary of Defense, going by that title. It used to be Secretary of War. But Forrestal became the first Secretary of Defense. He was a very strong person. He was thought to be most likely a very good candidate for president. So people who were watching Capitol Hill expected Forrestal to have a great career. He had also been a banker himself. And Strauss knew Forrestal, in fact, when they were bankers together in New York. But Strauss became Forrestal's assistant. He sat in the front office at the Pentagon. Anybody who wanted to get to Forrestal had to go through Strauss. This was almost exactly the same scenario with Herbert Hoover. You know, he was put in a position to know everything, to deal with everyone, to actually be the man to make these relationships and contacts and serve as the gatekeeper to all of this. And of course, in 1949, Forrestal leapt off a hospital building to his death. These are not the only two examples, but these are two examples that are easy to find. I think Strauss, too, is most famous for having ruined the career of Robert Oppenheimer. He had a personal vendetta against him. So how all of this atomic nuclear technology flowered and came into being is so close. It's so part of everything that he did. During Hoover's presidency, when Herbert Hoover was the president, I'm going to go back to an incident here because these things all kind of run together in time. If I was sticking to the chronology, I would have to put this right in there with all this sponsoring of scientists and all. He was O&I. He was a Kuhn Loeb partner. At that time, he was a full partner. He was assigned to the same district in New York, which I believe they had their office in New Jersey, but this was the New York office of the O&I that eventually made the contacts with Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky to protect the docks. Are you aware of that story, Jim?
Yes, that's actually very important about the rise of the mafia and its engagement with the CIA and so forth, which became long-term.
Yes, exactly. And anyway, Strauss was a lieutenant commander in this same office. But during the presidency of Hoover, he used his position in this office he was not the commander of the office, though. He had a superior named Paul Foster. He got his commanders to come to his offices at Kuhn Loeb, to sit in his big leathery mahogany office. And he gave them the impression that he was under presidential directive to pull a Watergate-style break-in on a couple of researchers who had compiled some very negative information on Hoover. And they believed him, and they did this act. They didn't actually bear any fruit with it because they didn't get any documentation. Somehow or another, they were tipped off in time to collect their things and vacate the place that was broken into. But the men that they were going after, that Strauss was going after on behalf of Hoover, one of these resulted in a book, and it was called The Strange Career of Herbert Hoover Under Two Flags. The man that he was pursuing was named James O'Brien. And I didn't write down Hamill, I guess. Hamill was the author of The Strange Career of Herbert Hoover. And there's so much of Strauss patterning himself after Hoover. What they had to say about Hoover at that time was that his life was like a blank slate. He was very obscure. Very little was ever known to the public. They basically elected this man on his reputation during World War I, that he was feeding the world, that he was known for helping people, getting them out of tight spots. But in fact, nobody really knew much about him at all. And, his whole business career was happening over in London. He was very close to the Rothschilds up there. He ended up working for them, working for their Rio Tinto mining outfits. So this is just another incident about Strauss, about his deviousness. He was willing to use, the O&I to sort of fake them out that he had the president's blessing for an illegal break-in. And who knows what they would have done had they gotten documents or gotten a hold of these men physically. There was another journalist who wrote an anti-Hoover book of some kind, and his name was Walter Liggett. And Walter Liggett ended up being gunned down gangland style by a crony of Meyer Lansky's. So there weren't too many anti-Hoover biographies. So Strauss was on the job. He was taking care of his chief. He was guarding whatever his interests were. And this included by 1933, he more or less adopted a physicist named Leo Szilard. Now, he says that he met Szilard in London. We all pretty much know the events of 1933, that Hitler rose to the Chancellery of Germany in January. And it began this exodus of academics. The British purported to step in, and according to them, they were going to save science. They were going to help all of these academics and scientists get out of Germany and get into a better place somewhere else. There were not too many that could actually come to England. So Leo Szilard was a Hungarian. He was a very good friend of the other Hungarians who came to the United States to work on the Manhattan Project. Before that time, they called themselves, or they were called, the Martians by others, because they were such an unusual and tight-knit little group. Leo Szilard had the ambition to build the first atomic bomb. He was inspired by H.G. Wells. And this was almost a joke amongst other physicists. So I believe that his burning ambition is what drove him to expose his possible machine to Einstein in Prague, to work with him after. Einstein and Szilard have a number of patents that they filed together. And some of these patents relate to the technology that's necessary for thermonuclear weapons. This is well prior to thermonuclear weapons, of course. So these are other relationships to follow. Strauss got himself right into that. He sponsored Szilard. Szilard made a decision in 1933 that he was going to stay in England and he was going to work with their refugee relocation service. It called itself the Academic Assistance Council. And there's a story here that he was standing on a street corner one day and the whole idea of fission and chain reaction just came into his mind. And what do you know? Within a number of months, he had patented the first nuclear reactor. And he filed it with the British Admiralty for safekeeping. These were his recollections later on. But this is 5 years now before the rest of the world knows about fission. So he stayed there until very late, until just prior to the outbreak of World War II. And then he came to New York also. He joined the other guys at Columbia and became part of the Manhattan Project. Strauss, during the war, was in the Bureau of Ordnance. He had nothing to do with the Manhattan Project. Or at least the people who did tried to keep him out of it. Apparently, once he had a job in the Pentagon, according to James Conant, who was a leader in the Manhattan Project, Strauss was just popped up everywhere. He was sticking his nose into everything. Those men turned out to be enemies. Conant was also supportive of Robert Oppenheimer, and by the mid-50s, of course, that whole situation, had erupted into a public display of what people considered to be at least very bad judgment. They took away Robert Oppenheimer's security clearance, and on what is very shabby character evidence. It was a very sad story, actually. But when you go back to this early development, how Strauss involved himself in everything, he was, deeply connected to the Rockefellers and the Rockefellers' money. And they were a big underwriter of the American Chemical Society. And, of course, that makes perfect sense. But at that time, they wanted to bring medical isotopes. Now, we know, that radium had been in use for quite a long time. There were a lot of experiments going on. A great deal of work was going on in France, and this was directly sponsored by Rothschilds in France. They established a radium institute, nominally as a place for the Curies. Pierre was long dead, but Maria Curie was there working. They were doing a very intense biological work there, as well as some of this high-energy physics. So in 1912 or so, scientists really began to understand what the isotopes are. Isotopes are chemically identical, but they have a different mass. Some of them are intensely radioactive. This is why they had to process all of this uranium and stuff. They were trying to create, good fuel, stuff that would just shoot out its particles. The whole key to fission is that, they find a neutron source, something that is powerful enough to split atoms. So the isotope industry got underway with a great deal of help from the Rockefellers. In the United States, Ernest Lawrence more or less took up the banner of that task, and he was in Berkeley, UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. He had a brother, John Lawrence, who worked at the UC San Francisco hospital. By the 30s or so, now most of the polio is intensifying over on the West Coast. A lot of things were happening. There were a lot of new sources of ore coming in. The Canadians had just this boon of uranium. They found ores up in the Northwest Territories, and by 1931, they were shipping it to Ontario out of this Port Hope. This is basically right across the big lake there from Rochester, New York. When you look at the Prohibition era, and I think this is very important to this story, that there's no explanation of how the Canadians actually brought all this radium to market. A lot of hinting going on that it was somehow deeply connected to these same channels of rum running. So I think nuclear traffic makes a lot of sense, and I think there was a lot of radium, which, now that the Canadians had brought some in, was going for about $100,000 a gram. A very small amount could be put in a briefcase and fetch a very high price somewhere, and it was in great demand amongst laboratories. I don't have any idea if people had thoughts about using it for weapons at that time, but it certainly could have been. They were using it for a lot of things. They were using some of the tailings of this process because it makes enormous mountains of radioactive tailings. They were turning a lot of that into fertilizer and actually fertilizing crops. It made crops kind of swell and grow large. So things that went by the pound, would have benefited from having some radium fertilizer. So,
and of course, many of the physicists you've been mentioning are among the most famous the world has ever known: Niels Bohr, Max Born, Albert Einstein, Szilard, and all that. And of course, he would eventually, they would send a letter to FDR, to which we can return after this, our final break. Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my special guest, Jennifer Lake, discussing the rise of the military-industrial medical complex. We'll be right back. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, concluding my conversation with Jennifer Lake about the rise of the military-industrial medical complex. Jennifer, I think you were about to address the famous letter to FDR.
The famous letter to FDR was written by Leo Szilard. But it was signed by Einstein. They enlisted Einstein in using his great fame and influence. But something kind of interesting about this, only about 10 years before, less than 10 years before, Einstein had publicly said, and I believe he even said this to FDR when he became president, that nuclear energy just was impossible. It was never going to happen. So, I mean, his word was good, I think, with FDR. And they must have believed him. So he was definitely showing a different side here, changing his mind. This famous letter said that, bombs can be made. We must hurry. It's obvious that other countries, Germany in particular, has this technology and they can do it. Part of the reason that I think there was such a spread and that the arms race was going to happen was that in this process of relocating these displaced scholars, Leo Szilard and others who helped in this process were actually putting very competent teams of people into industrialized countries. These guys wanted work. They wanted jobs. They wanted war work. This is what they did. Basically, this is, the whole kind of nurturing that went on in their science was to, produce weapons, ultimately. So they were taken really in for these reasons, I believe.
Well, not only was Einstein alarmed about the prospect of Germany developing an atomic bomb, but he also famously observed at one point in relation to nuclear energy that was splitting the atom was a bit of a ridiculous way to boil a cup of water.
Yeah, well...
And of course, we're living with the consequences of the nuclear energy industry today, especially in relation to Fukushima, where many of these operations consume, tremendous amount of energy just to get the nuclear power plants to operate properly. So it's a really complicated case, and it looks as though many of these plants have been designed in ways that make them inherently unsafe.
Well, we don't know how to control the technology. I think it's just that simple. These are systems that need to be perfect all the time, because accidents are just so devastating.
Yeah, and to never wear out or malfunction. I mean, how ridiculous is that?
Right. Well, it's, it has the status of being green. This is kind of why the renaissance of nuclear power seems to be actually potentially happening, because it's green. They're selling it to us as green energy.
I think, Jennifer, you've brought us right to the verge of World War II and the Manhattan Project.
Yes. Well, what's interesting about the letter, first of all, Louis Strauss was the first to know what was going to happen. He was the first to know about fission. He was the first to know what Szilard and Einstein were going to do. He was the first to know. He had an inside track on all of this. What was already occurring was that a supply of uranium oxide, the yellow cake, had already been sent by the CEO of the Union Minière de Haute-Katanga from the Belgian Congo. They had already sent it, and it was sitting on the docks in New York, where it sat for 2 years. It just sat out in the open, in drums. I think this was an Archer Daniels Midland. I don't know if Midland was part of that company at the time, but it was sitting on their docks near the Bayonne Bridge. That's a contaminated site today from having all this yellow cake there. But so all this preparation had been made. So the point being that atomic energy was secretly brought in. This was not an act of fate somehow. It wasn't a response to a tyrant waging war on the world. That this was by design, and that it was decades in the making. Herbert Hoover was part of it. You know, Herbert Hoover, while he was the Secretary of Commerce in the 1920s, they called him the Secretary of Commerce and the Undersecretary of everything else. I guess that was his nickname. And he was always out of his jurisdiction. He was very concerned about building power infrastructure. So the Hoover Dam, we've heard that. These other dams, these were basically drawn up and approved in the 1920s when Hoover was the Secretary of Commerce. What they said at the time, there's a man who left papers about this. His name is Mullendore. And he said that this, you know, the hydropower and everything else was so far beyond what the United States needed and even projected to need that they thought it would take us well into the 21st century. It's possible that, you know, that could still be the case. I don't know. But if, you know, we were to optimize those kinds of resources, would we ever even have had nuclear power plants? I don't know. It's possible. But they needed those power plants to run the Manhattan Project. They needed the Tennessee Valley Authority to supply Oak Ridge. This was the huge gaseous diffusion plant. It was more or less kind of the ideological center of the activity. This is where they did the separation. They were trying to create a very concentrated kind of bomb fuel out of an isotope called 235, U-235. There were numerous parts to the Manhattan Project. There were 9 major sites, but there were lots of sites that, you know, you have to research the whole story to begin finding a lot of these other sites. I guess the medical division was headed in Chicago. They had the Met Lab, the metallurgical laboratory there. And that's where Leo Szilard and the builders of the first reactor were in Chicago. So this was the beginning of the Manhattan Project. They used an awful lot of these refugee scientists in the Manhattan Project. Thousands of people. I have no idea how many, but I do know that many of them went into biological work afterwards. Leo Szilard himself became a founding member of the Salk Institute. I haven't even really talked about Jonas Salk, I don't think, and the creation of the polio vaccine. But during the war, this was very important also. I did mention that there was an association with polio and flu. In 1943, according to Army records, there was the most flu that has ever been in the world at one time was in 1943, far surpassed anything that happened in the Spanish flu. That this war theater activity, everything that was going around the world was actually sending waves of flu around the world. It was not the disease of the past, but this was more the kind of flu that polio infections are supposed to induce. This is a flu where you get a headache and a sore throat and a fever, and you go down for a few days. And it's that kind of flu. The Spanish flu, there are certainly aspects of that that look like something else, that look potentially like Ebola, for example, hemorrhagic fever. People were dying within 24 hours. The death rate in some of the places where they were having outbreaks was 90%. I think it was a very astonishing episode of biowarfare back in World War I. So that's a separate event. There is a man who wrote an interesting book about it called The Great Influenza. His name was John Barry. I learned a lot about different localities from him how that had gone. So just as you might expect, because there was a Spanish flu, there was enormous propaganda about flu ever since. And during World War II, they used flu as an excuse then to bring surveillance into every clinical setting in the United States, from a clinic on a campus, to a major hospital, to a mother's pregnancy circle. I mean, in every instance you can think of where there was some kind of medical supervision, flu surveillance became part of this whole picture of this military medical establishment. I see that it takes root here. It organized itself in World War II. This was one of the main ways in which it addressed itself. The government denied that there was ever any kind of problem with polio during the war. It's very hard to find any polio information in the United States. I've had very difficult time trying to get a hold of things. But after the war, of course, we really begin the nuclear era in earnest. 1945, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and then 1946, there was a big test out in the Marshall Islands called Crossroads. I've often thought that Crossroads meant to sort of, elicit this understanding that biological matter crosses itself, DNA crosses, mutations occur, new things are brought into being. Well, during 1943, Jonas Salk was working as an officer in the military medical establishment. They had an organization called the Armed Forces Epidemiological Board, and his mentor, a man named Thomas Francis, also worked there. He was the head of the flu division, I think, Thomas Francis. And Jonas Salk and Thomas Francis together were supposed to develop a flu vaccine for the Army. Well, I think they did something. I don't know that there was a flu vaccine up until relatively recently for the public, but there may have been something for the Army. They were doing similar work in Australia, developing flu vaccine there. But this is sort of what introduced him to this establishment. It brought Jonas Salk to the attention of people who were running bioweapons activity, a lot of it coming from Yale. That should be no surprise. Yale received about half of all the money that went into the whole medical division of the armed forces during World War II. After this, of course, we see that, a lot of these practices become established. We have to go back and give FDR a lot of credit, no one was quite the poster boy for the whole polio issue as FDR. He also had the Spanish flu, which is kind of interesting. 3 years before he developed paralysis, he had had the Spanish flu. He was the Undersecretary of the Navy at the time, and he was very, very sick. So there's something about these infections. They have a neurological basis. They may or may not be the viruses that people say they are. But there was so much experimentation that was done in these labs to alter them, to create new entities, some of which may have been quite unstable. It's a very strange process when you think about it. I think there's every reason to believe that the polio viruses that were used for the vaccines were lab creations. They had nothing to do with what the body would develop under normal injury from either radiation or chemicals. And I should say that polio research, as it stands, is very well proving that there are pesticides that cause polio, that this is another problem. I mean, pesticides are neurological poisons. Polio is a brain infection, and neurological poisons, act upon the system in a very similar way. So that's kind of a given. But the fact that radiation is something that you can track, in a completely different way to pesticides. It's really the hidden angle here. I have some graphs at the bottom of the front page at polioforever.wordpress. People go down there. This actually is a graph that's used by the National Institutes of Health, showing polio incidence in concurrence with pesticide use. Except it doesn't work. The graph doesn't work for pesticides, but the graph does work for nuclear tests. And this is fascinating to me. It's like something that's right in front of your eyes. And there it is. There are years when, there was almost no polio. And yet DDT usage did not change during those years. So it can't be DDT. They were still putting the DDT out at the same or greater volume when the polio dropped. So the correspondence has always been with the fallout, and I was able to find statistics from Canada that were very helpful for that. So that's essentially the association. As we carry on, Jim, if we can carry on, I hope so. I hope not to skip around. I don't want to confuse listeners on timelines and stuff. I've made a lot of timelines. They've been really helpful tools in researching all of this. They can see the timelines right there on the blogs. I would recommend that they read about Louis Strauss. There's an article at jenniferlake.wordpress.com called Louis Strauss and JFK. There's a complimentary posting there about, it's called JFK Conspiracy Con. And it really is about Louis Strauss also in many ways, because the argument is framed as being motivated by nuclear traffic. They were protecting their trade. They were protecting Israel's right to have weapons. They were protecting, their own establishment to keep weapons, to keep the power plants. I've done as much reading as I can, at least to this point, on a lot of the things about JFK and his life and his friends and what these motivations were. I see a little bit of Louis Strauss everywhere I look. He was involved. He's 1 degree of separation away from many of the people who are primed, activators of assassination plans. I believe that he had the power to call it, to arrange it, and to cover it up.
Well, I think you're making fascinating points about his being in a powerful position and having opposition to JFK, and I wouldn't be surprised if he played a contributing role. But that's a very elaborate subject on its own that requires distinguishing between the sponsors of the event, the facilitators of the event, and the actual mechanics on the ground, which we can discuss during another return engagement, because I think everything you're explaining here, Jennifer, is terribly, terribly important and really is largely unknown to the public, even to listeners of this show who are far more sophisticated and aware of what goes on in the world than the average American who receives his information in sound bites from a controlled press.
Well, I came to the right place then.
Oh, you did? You absolutely did. So I expect, we'll do a return engagement possibly as early as next Monday if you're available. And we'll talk about, Strauss in relation to the Atomic Energy Commission, the relation of many of these entities, including John J. McCloy, to Eisenhower and AEC, secret intelligence industry spying, and how all this may tie into the assassination of JFK, if that sounds like a plan that works for you.
I think that would work for me. Yeah. I would like to go over some of that in detail. Again, I have problems with the chronology. I don't think telling this is chronologically is actually easy to do. It might be a very boring way to present the material, too.
Well, worry not about that. What you're doing is going back and lacing things together, which is very, very appropriate. And, now that you've laid a foundation, I think we can move forward into some of these more complicated political issues related to the assassination and atomic energy and Leo Strauss's role in all of this. So I think you've done a good job of laying a foundation for us going further.
Well, good. I hope so, because there are even more stories to tell about him when it comes to assassination, his involvement in some high-level activity there.
Well, what we'll do, Jennifer, is plan to do a second interview a week from today, and I look forward to it. Why don't you reiterate your websites where our listeners can go for more information in the meanwhile?
All right. Well, the information about polio caused by radiation is at polioforever.wordpress.com. Diseases that are related to polio or that may have once been called polio are also listed there. I think it's eye-opening to look at that. There's a whole association with the vaccine as being for the purpose of fallout, trying to prevent illness from fallout, and possibly from cancer also. They did use cancer cells to cultivate the viruses they used in the vaccines. So all of that information is there at polioforever.wordpress.com.
Well, Jennifer, I can't thank you enough for being here. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, thanking my special guest, Jennifer Lake, for being here, tracing the rise of the military-industrial medical complex, and all of you for listening.